Hunter Walker is a Yahoo News White House correspondent. He is joining us now from Washington with more on the looming government shutdown. Hunter, I just want to take our viewers back to the president's comments about the shutdown, sort of saying that he would like to see another shutdown if he can't get this deal. What are you hearing from the White House about the possibility of that? We saw lawmakers pushing back in that meeting, but what is the White House saying?
Well, we saw Sarah Sanders come out Tuesday afternoon and play some very quick cleanup because the president's comments really threw a grenade into these talks around the two-year deal, because that essentially involves tabling the immigration question. And President Trump returned it to sort of where we were ahead of the last shutdown, where it was funding for border security versus a DACA fix. And, that was the standoff. And he implied that he wouldn't, he wanted a shutdown if he couldn't get the border security funding he wanted, which goes against the plan to pass a two-year agreement and deal with immigration later. So Sarah Sanders came out and said, they are supportive of the two-year agreement, and they wouldn't expect that to include immigration. So I think we're back to where we were before those comments, but these talks are very, very sensitive, and he certainly added a note of instability.
Yeah, but the shutdown is midnight tomorrow. We have this stopgap measure come from the House. We have a longer-term bill that the Senate is sort of wrangling with. I mean, how will this play out to actually ensure that there is no government shutdown? Could the Senate pass the House's bill in time?
Well, as you said, we are right up against the deadline. Since Congress has been subsisting on these short-term CRs and almost shutdowns for some time now, they are good at moving quickly on these deadlines. And we've seen the House Democrats move this retreat that they plan to take on the eastern shore of Maryland to the Capitol so they can be here to work on this. What I'm hearing from people on Capitol Hill is that, leadership does seem to be behind, leadership in the House, Republican leadership seems to be behind this two-year deal. They expect it will do well in the Senate. The deal involves Republicans getting the increases in military spending that they want. Democrats want exactly equal increases in domestic spending. They're not quite there yet, but we are seeing an increase there as well. The question really is in the House because, Nancy Pelosi had House Democrats very strongly in line saying they wouldn't sign off on any budget deal that didn't include a DACA fix. And as I was saying, this punts the immigration discussion down the road, and it's going to be interesting to see whether Democratic House members can back that.
So, Hunter, I want to play for our viewers the sound of President Trump talking about the shutdown, because I want to ask you a question about sort of his tone and his tenor after it rolls. Let's play that.
We'll do a shutdown, and it's worth it for our country. I'd love to see a shutdown if we don't get this stuff taken care of. If we have to shut it down because the Democrats don't want safety, then shut it down. We'll go with another shutdown.
So, Hunter, as you well know, the president many times, oftentimes, plays to his base. Is it your sense from the White House that they feel that the last shutdown was a Trump victory, a Trump win, and that's why the president seems to be sort of flippant about this shutdown, even though both sides of the aisle have suggested that they don't want to see that happen again?
Well, they definitely feel that they've put the Democrats into a tough corner. The White House put out its own framework for immigration that would give a DACA fix, in fact, an even more generous one than some Democrats asked for, including a pathway to citizenship, also for people who were eligible for the program but had not signed up. But that includes a couple poison pills that the Democrats don't want, like curbs to legal immigration and this funding for border security that's a real priority for President Trump. So the White House created a position where Democrats essentially backed down from the last shutdown. As I was saying, the House initially said they wouldn't do any short-term deal that didn't include the DACA fix, and they dropped that demand, essentially. And that loses them a lot of leverage. And the White House line is basically that Democrats realized that people would blame them for a shutdown. And I think that's true to an extent. But what's really interesting about President Trump's comments is it's as though he hadn't been briefed on the latest from Capitol Hill. Because as we were discussing earlier, there is this two-year agreement that, is the product of sensitive and ongoing talks that Republican leadership is very eager to get done. And, Trump's comments essentially ignored that and blew it up. So, they were confident last week, but they can return to that place of confidence, and maybe even more so if they get this two-year deal done. And he was essentially speaking against it.
Right. So let's talk about DACA. It expires March 5th. That is the deadline. So if they're not going to include DACA in any funding deal, and right now it doesn't seem like it will be included, then what happens with that? The lawmakers have a month to hammer out something. John Kelly, the chief of staff, says he really doubts that the president would be willing to extend that deadline.
And I think it's really important that we speak very clearly and technically when we talk about DACA, because there are a lot of people whose lives are hanging in the balance. So, there are approximately 700,000, maybe 800,000 people who have been recipients of this program in the country. These are young undocumented immigrants who arrived here as children and are currently getting these 2-year work permits. That March 5th deadline doesn't mean they'll all be removed from the country tomorrow. What it means is that there are no more new renewals for 2-year work permits to DACA. So, just to be clear, this is a phase out we're talking about. But John Kelly did say on Capitol Hill that he doesn't think the president would support any extension. So that keeps the pressure on to make this deal, because a lot of people will start being forced to leave the country if there's no deal made before that deadline. And also to point out, this whole time, really, since President Trump announced he would let the program expire in September, there have been people losing their status and losing their protections. Immigration advocates say 100 or so people a day are losing protections as this program hangs in the balance and they can't make a deal.
Hunter, before we let you go, you reported that just a day after the Dow suffered its worst point drop in history, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin testified before the House Financial Services Committee. How did he explain the recent market volatility?
Monday, we saw the Dow have its largest point drop in history, around 1,175 points. Steve Mnuchin had pre-scheduled testimony before the Financial Services Committee, and so this was obviously a major question Tuesday morning. He admitted he was checking his iPhone as he spoke to them and sort of watching the market that day, and it had started to rebound and did by the end of the day go up about 500 points, so it regained some of those losses. But the Treasury Secretary's larger point was that, the market has gone up a lot in the first year of the Trump administration, and overall they do think it's sound. He just kept pointing to those prior gains, and he said the quote-unquote fundamentals of the economy are strong, and he's not concerned about temporary volatility. Do
you think politics is playing a role at all on the markets?
It's hard to say because, this was an extraordinary day. And overall, things are up. Obviously, the markets move very quickly with these algorithmic traders that we have there now. But, I do think that whenever you have risks of a government shutdown in the longer term, we're talking with the Russia probe about a potential constitutional crisis. Wall Street does not like that kind of instability. So, it's hard not to think that some of this volatility is coming from Washington.
Right.
Finally, Hunter, you were in the press briefing room yesterday when Sarah Huckabee Sanders took questions from reporters. What did she have to say about the president's remarks regarding Democrats who refused to stand and applaud during his State of the Union speech? He called them un-American and treasonous in a speech that he delivered in Cincinnati.
Well, I should note my colleague Olivier Knox was there in person, but I was watching on the live stream as this was the first briefing we've had in some time. This has not been a high watermark of transparency for this White House. But, one thing, basically Sarah Sanders set up an equation where she said, do Democrats hate this country, hate this president more than they love this country? And she sort of doubled down on the president's idea that not cheering for him at the State of the Union was treasonous or un-American. But I think all of our viewers will know it's actually basically an American tradition for the opposition party to sit and act grumpy when the president makes a speech during the State of the Union. So, that's why people were so alarmed by his remarks. I mean, treason is literally a very serious charge, and he levied at Democrats for doing something that has long been a part of bipartisan politics in Washington.
Yeah. Can you imagine if President Obama had said to Congressman Joe Wilson,
you
are being treasonous by shouting out, you lie, during President...
It was unprecedented. Obama was shouted at. That's very different than what we saw last week on Capitol Hill.
Which is normal. Exactly. What you're suggesting, obviously, and pointing out is that there's a rich tradition in this country of not clapping, not applauding when you are not in power. I actually love the parliamentary system that they have in the United Kingdom, where they just boo and hiss you when they don't like what you say.
And occasionally there's a brawl.
Hunter Walker, always good to talk to you, my friend. Thank you.
Good to see you guys.